My name is Renee Castillo. I'm 39 years old. I've owned a small flower shop for 14 years, which means I've spent most of my adult life learning one very specific, very practical thing about grief. When something is dying, you don't panic and try to save all of it at once. You go still. You look closely. You figure out exactly what can still be saved, and you cut away, carefully, everything that can't. That instinct is the only reason I didn't fall apart when my mother-in-law stood up at my husband's one-year memorial gathering, in front of 40-some friends and family gathered in the backyard where Miles and I got married 11 years earlier, and said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, she was never really part of this family. Miles's money should go to the people who actually loved him first, not to a woman who married her way into his life and then talked him into changing everything 6 months before he died. The yard went quiet. Somebody's fork stopped halfway to their mouth. I stood there, holding a small glass of white wine I hadn't touched, and I did the thing I do every single day at the shop with an arrangement that's already past saving. I didn't try to argue my way out of that moment in real time. I went still. I let the silence sit exactly where Patricia had put it, because what she didn't know, what she'd apparently convinced herself, and her lawyer, and half of my late husband's extended family, wasn't true, was that Miles hadn't been talked into anything at all. He'd walked into that decision with his eyes completely open, 6 months before he died, specifically because he already knew, better than any of us, exactly what his mother was capable of once he was gone. If you've ever been accused, publicly, of stealing something you were actually just quietly, carefully protecting, stay with me to the end, because this one has a piece of evidence in it that a courtroom eventually had to reckon with. Subscribe and drop the word protected in the comments right now, before we even begin. Let's go back to the beginning, though, because you need the whole shape of my marriage and my mother-in-law and the year my husband spent dying to understand exactly what that backyard accusation actually got wrong and exactly what it cost Patricia to say it out loud. I met Miles Castillo at a farmer's market on a Saturday morning in early spring, at my own flower stall, back when my business was still small enough that I ran it entirely alone out of a rented stand rather than the storefront I have now. He bought a single bunch of ranunculus, told me, with a specific, self-deprecating charm I'd learned was entirely characteristic of him, that he had no idea what a ranunculus even was, but that the color reminded him of a sunset he'd once seen in Portugal, and asked, somewhat clumsily, whether I'd want to get coffee sometime. I said yes. We were married 2 years later, in the backyard of the house we'd bought together, under a canopy of flowers I'd arranged myself, because some things you simply have to do with your own hands. I want to describe those 2 years of courtship a little more fully, because I think they matter for understanding exactly what kind of partnership Miles and I eventually built, and why his final act of protection made sense as an extension of everything that came before it, rather than some sudden, uncharacteristic gesture. Miles courted me with the same methodical attentiveness he brought to everything else in his life. He remembered, after our very first coffee, that I'd mentioned struggling to find a reliable delivery van for the shop, and showed up, 3 weeks later, with a list of 5 specific vehicles he'd researched, complete with mileage histories and maintenance records, not because I'd asked him to, but because he'd simply noticed a problem in my life and quietly set about trying to solve it, the same careful instinct that would, years later, lead him to build an entire legal case, protecting me before either of us knew exactly when he'd need it. He proposed on the 1-year anniversary of that first farmer's market conversation, at the same stall, having arranged, in advance, with the market's organizers, for me to be surprised with an empty booth space that morning, supposedly due to some paperwork mix-up, only to watch him walk toward me across the empty space holding the exact same bunch of ranunculus he'd bought a year earlier, a ring, balanced carefully among the stems. I said yes before he'd even finished the sentence he'd clearly rehearsed. Our early marriage was, in most ways, wonderfully ordinary. Building careers, buying our first small house, learning each other's specific rhythms and habits in the way new couples do. Miles worked as a petroleum engineer for a mid-sized energy company, methodical and precise in a way that, at first glance, seemed almost at odds with the warmth and easy humor he brought to the rest of his life, but that I came to understand, over 11 years of marriage, were actually 2 expressions of the exact same underlying quality: a deep, careful attentiveness to getting things right, whether that meant a technical calculation at work or the specific way he remembered, every single year to buy me ranunculus on the anniversary of that first farmer's market conversation. His mother, Patricia, was a different kind of person entirely, and I want to try to describe her fairly, because I think this story only makes sense if you understand her as a genuinely complicated, grieving woman rather than a flat villain. Patricia had raised Miles largely on her own after his father left when Miles was 9, working 2 jobs for much of his childhood to keep their household afloat, and I think that specific, hard-won history shaped something in her that never fully softened, even decades later, even after Miles had grown into a stable, successful adult with a marriage and a home of his own. Patricia's love for her son was real and fierce, and also, over the years I knew her, frequently expressed through a kind of anxious, controlling vigilance that I came to understand as her particular way of trying to protect something she'd fought hard to build almost entirely alone. From nearly the beginning of our relationship, Patricia held me at a specific, careful distance, never openly hostile, never cruel in any dramatic, easily nameable way, but consistently, quietly withholding in a manner I recognized, over time, as its own kind of message. She referred to me, for the first several years of our marriage, as Miles's wife, rather than by my name, in conversations with her own friends and extended family, a small but pointed habit I noticed and never mentioned. She called Miles more often than she called our shared household line, a distinction that persisted even after 11 years of marriage, as though some part of her had simply never fully updated her understanding of where her son's primary household now was. When Miles and I bought our second home, a modest but meaningful upgrade we'd worked hard for, Patricia's first comment, upon seeing it, was to ask Miles, in front of me, whether he was sure this was a wise financial decision, a question she never once, in 11 years, asked me directly, though I contributed equally to every major financial decision in our marriage. I don't want to overstate the hostility, because it genuinely wasn't constant or dramatic. There were good years, warm holidays, moments of real, easy connection between us, particularly once our niece and nephew. Miles's brother, Dominic's children, were born, and Patricia and I found common ground in shared grandmotherly and auntly affection for 2 children we both adored. But underneath even the warmest of those years, there remained a specific, persistent current I never fully stopped noticing. A sense, communicated in dozens of small ways over more than a decade, that in Patricia's mind, I remained, fundamentally, an addition to her son's life rather than a genuine, permanent expansion of her own family. I want to give you 2 more specific memories from those years, because I think they capture the texture of that dynamic more precisely than a general description can. The first happened at our own wedding, 11 years ago, during the toasts. Patricia stood, glass in hand, and spoke warmly, genuinely, for several minutes about Miles. His childhood, his kindness, the specific pride she felt watching him build a life. She never once, in that entire toast, said my name. She referred to me only as the woman Miles has chosen, a phrase technically warm in tone, but I noticed even in the joyful haze of my own wedding day, curiously withholding of the one word that would have cost her nothing to say. I mentioned it to Miles that night, gently, and he told me, a little sadly, that he'd noticed too, and that he thought it was simply how his mother processed change. Slowly, cautiously, holding new people at a careful linguistic distance until she'd fully decided they belonged. The second memory happened 5 years into our marriage, when my own father passed away unexpectedly, and Patricia, to her credit, did make an effort to attend the funeral and offer condolences. But in the receiving line afterward, greeting my grieving mother for the first time, Patricia introduced herself as Miles's mother, rather than offering any framing that acknowledged her own connection to me directly, as my mother-in-law, as someone who might have had a relationship to my grief in her own right. My mother mentioned it to me weeks later, gently, not unkindly, simply observing that Patricia had seemed, throughout that whole difficult day, somewhat unsure of what role she actually occupied in my life, beyond her connection through her son. I share these 2 memories not to build a case against Patricia, exactly, but because I think they illustrate something important about the specific shape of our relationship over more than a decade. Not open hostility, but a consistent, quiet uncertainty about where exactly I fit into her understanding of family. An uncertainty that, I would come to understand much later, was rooted in something far more complicated and more painful than simple dislike. Miles was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 2 years ago, at 44, following months of vague, difficult to place symptoms that his doctors had initially attributed to stress and dietary issues before a scan finally revealed the truth. I won't dwell extensively on the medical details, because I don't think they're the actual heart of this story. But I do want you to understand the texture of that year, because it's where everything that later happened with the life insurance actually began. Patricia's response to Miles's diagnosis was, in its own way, entirely consistent with everything I'd observed about her over the preceding decade. An intense, almost fierce mobilization of love and attention, channeled, as it had always been, primarily toward Miles directly, with me positioned, once again, somewhere at the edge of the frame. She called him daily, sometimes multiple times a day, offering opinions on treatment options she'd researched extensively but that his actual oncology team had already carefully considered and, in several cases, ruled out for specific medical reasons Patricia struggled to accept. She questioned decisions Miles and I made together as a couple. Decisions about his care, his comfort, how he wanted to spend his remaining time. In ways that, several times over that difficult year, left Miles emotionally exhausted from having to repeatedly reassure and manage his own mother's anxiety on top of managing his own terminal illness. I remember one particular afternoon, roughly 4 months into his diagnosis, when Patricia arrived unannounced while Miles was resting, deeply fatigued from a recent chemotherapy session, and insisted, over my gentle attempts to explain that he needed rest, on waking him to discuss a specific alternative treatment she'd read about online. Miles, exhausted and in pain, eventually asked her, as gently as he could manage, to let him rest, and Patricia left upset, calling me later that evening to say, pointedly, that she didn't understand why I was keeping her from her own son during the most important time of his life. I didn't have the energy, in that moment, to explain that I wasn't keeping her from anything. That her son, dying, simply needed rest more than he needed another difficult conversation about treatments his own doctors had already carefully evaluated. I want to describe one more incident from that period, because it directly foreshadows what would eventually happen with the insurance policy, though none of us fully understood that at the time. Roughly 2 months into his diagnosis, Miles and I sat down together with a financial planner to review our overall finances and prepare for the very real possibility that his illness might progress faster than any of us hoped. During that same week, Patricia called Miles, unprompted, to ask directly what his plans were for the life insurance policy, framing the question, she later insisted, as simple, practical concern, but landing, in the moment, as something closer to anxious calculation. Miles told me about the call that evening, visibly troubled by it, and said, quietly, I know she doesn't mean it the way it sounds, but it sounds like she's already worried about what she's owed, and I haven't even finished my second round of chemo yet. That conversation, small as it seemed at the time, planted something in Miles that would grow, over the following months, into the careful, deliberate plan he eventually enacted. I also want to be fair to Patricia here, because I think it matters for understanding her fully. Beneath the anxious, sometimes intrusive behavior during that year, there was also real, aching grief. A mother watching her only remaining close family relationship with her son threatened by an illness she had no power to fix after already having lost so much control over his life once he married and built a household that wasn't hers to manage. I watched her, more than once during that year, step outside during a difficult appointment to compose herself, returning with red-rimmed eyes and a forced, brittle brightness that broke my heart even as it also, at times, exhausted me. Grief and control, in Patricia, were never fully separable from each other. I understood that even then, even as I struggled, in the moment, to extend her the patience that understanding required. It was during this same difficult stretch, roughly 6 months before Miles died, that he first raised, quietly, on a Tuesday evening while we sat together on our back porch, the subject of his life insurance policy. Miles had held a life insurance policy through his employer for most of his career, valued at $1.8 million, a substantial sum he'd built up over nearly 2 decades of steady employment and periodic increases in coverage as his career had progressed. The original beneficiary designation, set up years before I'd even met him, split the policy between Patricia and myself once we married. 60% to me, 40% to his mother, a division Miles had set up. He explained to me that evening on the porch to make sure Mom was always taken care of too, no matter what happened. What he told me next, that evening, I want to walk through carefully because I think it matters enormously for understanding what happened later. Miles told me he'd been thinking, in the specific, clear-eyed way dying people sometimes develop about their own remaining decisions, about what would actually happen to that money once he was gone, and about his mother's specific relationship to money and control throughout his entire life. My mom's never going to be okay with just accepting anything, he said, quietly, looking out at the yard where we'd gotten married. She's going to want a say in how it's used, or she's going to feel like it needs to come with strings, or she's going to end up in some kind of conflict with you about it eventually, even if she doesn't mean to. I've watched her do this my entire life, Renee. I love her. I'm not saying this to be cruel about her, but I don't want my death to become the thing that finally breaks whatever's left of your relationship with her. And I think if I leave this the way it currently is, that's exactly what's going to happen. I asked him what he wanted to do instead. He told me he wanted to change the beneficiary designation to leave the full policy to me, entirely, with a separate, smaller life insurance policy. One he intended to take out specifically and immediately while he still could. Designated directly to Patricia in an amount that would meaningfully support her, but that would exist as its own separate, uncomplicated gift entirely outside of any decision-making, authority I would otherwise hold over the larger policy. I want to be honest that I initially pushed back on this plan, not because I didn't understand his reasoning, but because I was afraid, even then, of exactly the situation that eventually unfolded. That Patricia would see any change to the original arrangement as evidence that I'd somehow influenced Miles against her, regardless of how carefully or thoughtfully the change had actually been made. I told him this directly. His response is something I've held on to every day since. "That's exactly why I need to do this the right way," he said. "Not quietly. Not just quickly changing a form somewhere. I want to do this with a lawyer, with a doctor confirming I'm entirely in my right mind, with everything documented so thoroughly that there's no room for anyone to ever credibly claim you had anything to do with the decision beyond simply being my wife. I know my mother, Renee. I know exactly what she's capable of believing once grief gets involved. I'm not going to leave you unprotected against that." Over the following 3 weeks, Miles did exactly what he'd described, with a thoroughness that, looking back, I understand now as one of the last, most deliberate acts of care he was able to offer me before his illness eventually took away his ability to manage complex decisions at all. He met with an estate attorney, David Kessler, independently, without me present for the initial consultation, specifically so that no one could later claim I had guided or influenced the conversation. He requested, on his own initiative, a formal capacity evaluation from an independent psychiatrist, unaffiliated with his regular oncology team, whose sole purpose was to assess and document, in writing, that Miles was entirely competent, clear-minded, and acting under no undue influence or impairment at the time he made these decisions. He had the entire consultation with his attorney recorded on video, with his own explicit request and consent, walking through his reasoning in his own words, on camera, addressing, directly and by name, the exact concern he anticipated his mother might eventually raise. I still have that video. I've watched it more times than I can count, in the months since he died, and I want to share, briefly, some of what he actually said in it, because I think his own words matter more than any summary I could offer. Looking directly into the camera, steady and clear despite being visibly thinner and more fatigued than he'd been just months earlier, Miles said, "If you're watching this, it probably means my mother has questioned this decision, or is questioning it right now, in some kind of formal setting. Mom, if that's you, I love you. I have loved you my entire life, and nothing about this decision changes that. But I need you to hear, directly from me, in my own voice, while I was still entirely myself, that this was my decision, made with full understanding of what I was doing, made specifically because I know how hard it can be for you to trust that someone loves our family without needing to control every part of it. Renee has never once, in 11 years, given me a single reason to doubt her. I am leaving her this because I trust her completely, and because I need you to trust that too, even though I understand that trusting it might be hard. He also took out, that same month, a separate, additional life insurance policy specifically for Patricia, valued at $300,000, funded from our own joint savings rather than any reduction to his existing employer policy, explicitly structured as an unconditional, uncomplicated gift that would arrive to her directly, with no connection whatsoever to me or to any decision I might make. I was present, at Miles's request, for the actual recording session itself, though not for his private initial consultation with David. I remember the specific, strange formality of that afternoon. David's office, a small conference room with a single camera set up on a tripod in the corner, a court reporter present to certify the proceedings, the independent psychiatrist, Dr. Ainsley Whitmore, seated quietly to one side, having already completed her formal evaluation earlier that same week. Miles wore a simple blue button-down shirt, the same one, I noticed, that he'd worn to his own father's funeral decades earlier. A detail he mentioned to me, quietly, before the recording began, almost as though he wanted some piece of his own history present in the room, even as he prepared to speak about his future absence. David asked him a series of careful, deliberate questions on camera. His full name, his understanding of what he was doing, his relationship to the parties involved, his reasoning, stated plainly and in his own words. Miles answered each question with the same steady clarity that had characterized his entire career as an engineer, pausing occasionally, visibly working to steady himself against both physical fatigue and emotional weight, but never once faltering in the actual substance of what he was saying. I sat slightly outside the camera's frame, at Miles's specific request, close enough that he could see me if he needed to, but positioned so that no one reviewing the footage later could ever credibly claim I'd influenced his answers in real time. There was one moment during that recording I've returned to many times since. Partway through, David asked Miles directly whether anyone, including me, had pressured or encouraged him toward this decision. Miles paused, longer than he had for any other question, and then said, looking directly into the camera rather than toward David, "Renee doesn't know I'm doing this in this much detail. She knows the general plan. She doesn't know I'm recording this specific message, because I wanted this part to be entirely mine. My own words, not anything she helped shape, so that nobody could ever say she guided even the way I chose to say this. I hadn't known, until that exact moment, watching him say it, how carefully he'd separated his general decision, which we'd discussed together as partners, from this specific, deliberate act of protection, which he'd built almost entirely alone, precisely so that it would stand as unquestionably his. I want to be honest that I didn't fully understand, in that moment, how important all of this careful documentation would eventually become. I understood it as an act of love, a characteristically thorough, careful gesture from a man who spent his entire career getting complicated things exactly right. I did not yet understand that it would, 8 months later, become the actual, central evidence in a courtroom. Miles's condition declined steadily over the following 5 months, and I want to be honest that much of that period is difficult for me to recall in precise, orderly detail, the way grief sometimes compresses and blurs even significant stretches of time. What I remember most clearly is how present Miles remained, emotionally, even as his physical capacity diminished. How he continued, almost until the very end, to think carefully about the people he loved and what he wanted to leave them, not just financially, but in every sense. I want to describe a few specific moments from those months, because I think they matter more than a general summary of decline. 3 months before he died, still strong enough for short outings, Miles insisted on driving us both to the coast for an afternoon, somewhere we'd gone often in the early years of our marriage, and spent much of that day, sitting on a bench overlooking the water, telling me stories from his childhood I'd never heard before. Specific memories of his mother working double shifts, coming home exhausted, still finding the energy to help him with homework at the kitchen table before falling asleep in her chair. "I don't think she ever really got to rest, growing up my mom," he said, quietly, watching the water. I think some part of what makes her so hard to be around sometimes is just that she never had the chance to stop being vigilant. Not even once I was grown and fine. I understood, hearing him say it, that even as he prepared the legal protections he knew I'd eventually need, he never once stopped holding real, complicated compassion for the woman he was protecting me from. 2 months before he died, no longer able to manage stairs easily, Miles asked me to help him move his home office setup down to our ground floor, and spent several of his remaining good afternoons there, working through, with quiet, methodical care, a series of letters to people in his life: colleagues, old friends, Dominic, his mother. He never showed me what he wrote to Patricia, and I never asked, understanding, somehow, that whatever he'd written was meant to exist between the two of them alone, separate from anything I was owed to see. I know only that when she received it, after his death, she read it privately, in her own home, and never once, in all the months of conflict that followed, mentioned its contents to me directly. Though I sometimes wondered, watching her during that difficult year, whether some of what he'd written in that letter was quietly, slowly working on her in ways neither of us could see from the outside. Patricia's presence during those final months remained fraught in the same ways it always had been, though grief, I think, sharpened rather than softened her particular tendencies. She questioned hospice decisions Miles and I had carefully made together. She occasionally implied, in ways that were never quite direct enough to confront cleanly, that she believed I was somehow limiting her access to her own son during his final weeks, when in reality, Miles himself, increasingly fatigued and increasingly protective of the limited energy he had left, had begun asking me to help manage and moderate visits from several family members, Patricia included, simply because he no longer had the physical stamina for the emotionally intensive conversations she often wanted to have. In his final 2 weeks, largely bedbound, Miles spoke less and slept more, but remained, in his clearer moments, entirely himself, asking after my flower shop, teasing me gently about a delivery van repair I'd been putting off, holding my hand for long stretches without needing to say anything at all. Patricia visited nearly every day during that final stretch, and I want to be fair and say that whatever complicated history existed between the three of us, her devotion during those final weeks was real and constant, sitting beside her son for hours, reading to him from books he'd loved as a child, a tenderness that existed alongside, rather than instead of everything else that would later unfold. Miles died on a Thursday morning in October, at home, in the bed we'd shared for over a decade, with me beside him. I won't dwell further on that morning, except to say that his final, coherent words to me, hours before he lost the ability to speak clearly at all, were, "You're going to be okay. I made sure of that. I need you to actually believe that once I'm gone." I didn't fully understand, in that raw, immediate moment of loss, how literally he meant those words. The funeral itself, 3 days later, was difficult in all the ordinary, expected ways grief makes a funeral difficult. But it was made harder by an undercurrent I sensed almost immediately in Patricia's behavior, a specific, watchful coldness toward me that felt different from her usual careful distance, sharper somehow, though I couldn't yet identify why. I want to describe that day a little more fully, because certain moments from it took on new, retrospective meaning once I understood, weeks later, what Patricia had already begun setting in motion. Dominic, Miles's younger brother by 3 years, gave the eulogy. Warm, funny in places, genuinely moving, full of specific memories of the two of them growing up, learning to fish together. Miles's patient, older brother habit of covering for Dominic's occasional teenage mistakes without ever once holding it over him. I'd always liked Dominic, a gentler, less anxious presence than his mother, married with 2 young children who adored their Uncle Miles, and I remember standing beside him at the burial afterward, both of us quietly crying, feeling, in that moment, a genuine, uncomplicated solidarity that I wish, now, I'd understood to hold on to more deliberately in the difficult months that followed. Patricia, throughout the service itself, remained composed in the specific, controlled way she'd always carried herself in public settings, accepting condolences with practiced grace, thanking guests individually as they filed past. It was only afterward, at the small reception held at our house, that I noticed something had shifted. She spent much of that afternoon in quiet, closed conversation with a cousin I didn't recognize well, glancing toward me periodically in a way that felt, even then, subtly different from her usual guarded distance, watchful in a new, more deliberate way. I didn't think much of it at the time, attributing it, generously, to the specific, disorienting grief of the day itself. I understand now, looking back, that this was very likely the exact period during which she'd already begun quietly discussing, with whichever relatives would listen, the version of events that would eventually become her formal legal claim. I found out why 6 weeks later, when I received formal legal notice that Patricia, through an attorney, had filed a claim contesting the beneficiary designation on Miles's life insurance policy, alleging, in the specific, careful language of the legal filing, that the change had been made under circumstances suggesting undue influence exerted upon the decedent during a period of significant physical and cognitive vulnerability, and requesting that the court either restore the original 60-40 split or, alternatively, invalidate the beneficiary change entirely in favor of Patricia receiving the full policy amount as Miles's sole surviving parent. I want to be honest about how that notice landed. I had, somehow, despite everything, not fully anticipated that Patricia would actually take this step formally, through the legal system, rather than simply expressing her hurt and confusion privately, the way she had, in various forms, throughout the entirety of Miles's illness. Reading that filing, alone in our kitchen, 6 weeks after burying my husband, remains one of the most disorienting moments of an already disorienting year. I want to describe those 6 weeks between the funeral and the legal notice a little more fully, because I think the specific texture of that time matters for understanding just how blindsided I actually was. Those weeks were, in almost every visible way, ordinary grieving. Patricia and I spoke on the phone twice, briefly, both conversations stilted but not overtly hostile, mostly logistics about thank you cards and a headstone Miles's family wanted to help select. She attended a small gathering at our house 3 weeks after the funeral, bringing a casserole, hugging me at the door, staying for over an hour, talking with other relatives about Miles's childhood in a way that seemed, on its surface, entirely consistent with ordinary, if complicated, grief. I had no idea, watching her that afternoon, that she had already retained an attorney the week before and had already begun the process of formally contesting the very decision her son had spent his final months so carefully documenting. I called my closest friend, Elena, the evening I received the legal notice, mostly because I didn't know what else to do with the specific, disorienting mix of grief and disbelief I was carrying. Elena had known Miles almost as long as I had stood beside me at our wedding, and had watched, over the years, every incremental layer of my relationship with Patricia unfold in real time. "I need you to hear this and tell me if I'm overreacting," I said, and I read her the filing, my voice unsteady in a way it hadn't been since the actual funeral. Elena was quiet for a long moment after I finished. "You're not overreacting," she said, finally. "But Renee, Miles built that file specifically because he knew this might happen. I think you need to trust that he already fought this fight for you, months before either of you knew exactly when it would come." I called David Kessler, Miles's estate attorney, the same afternoon. He was, I think, less surprised than I was, and he told me something that steadied me considerably in that moment. "Miles anticipated this specifically," he said. "That's exactly why we built the file the way we did. I want you to trust the process here, Renee. He gave us everything we need." The formal legal proceedings moved slowly, the way these things often do, with an initial mediation scheduled roughly 8 months out. In the meantime, our extended family had already planned Miles's one-year memorial gathering, a backyard event at our home, the same yard where we'd married, meant to bring together friends and family to remember him on the anniversary of his death. I debated, seriously, whether to invite Patricia at all, given the ongoing lawsuit, but ultimately decided that excluding her from a gathering meant to honor her own son felt like a cruelty I wasn't willing to commit, regardless of what she'd done. I want to describe the early part of that afternoon, because it matters for understanding just how much of an ambush the eventual accusation actually was, even for the people standing closest to me. The gathering had unfolded, for its first 2 hours, with the specific, bittersweet warmth these occasions often carry. Friends sharing stories about Miles's dry sense of humor, his colleagues from the energy company describing his meticulous, well-respected work, his college roommate telling a long, affectionate story about a road trip the two of them had taken decades earlier that had most of the yard laughing through tears. I'd spent weeks preparing the flowers myself, an arrangement built specifically around ranunculus, the same flower from our first meeting, displayed on every table throughout the yard. Patricia had arrived roughly an hour into the gathering, greeted me with a stiff but not overtly hostile hug, and spent much of the early afternoon speaking quietly with Dominic and a small cluster of Miles's cousins near the far end of the yard. She came. And partway through the afternoon, over the low murmur of 40 gathered friends and family, sharing memories of Miles, my mother, seated near the drink table, still unaware of the specific tensions simmering beneath the day's surface warmth, happened to mention, gently, to a nearby cousin, how proud Miles had always been of the life he'd built with me. It was an entirely innocent comment, the kind of thing said at dozens of memorial gatherings without incident. But something in it seemed to land wrong with Patricia, standing near enough to overhear, and I watched her expression shift, visibly, in the space of a few seconds, from the careful composure she'd maintained all afternoon into something sharper and more raw. She stood, wineglass in hand, and delivered, unprompted, the accusation that opens this story. That I'd never really been part of the family. That I'd talked Miles into changing everything. That his money should go to people who'd loved him first. I want to walk you through what actually happened in the minutes immediately following that accusation, because I think the specific shape of it matters. Several people in the yard went visibly, uncomfortably still. Miles's brother Dominic, standing near the drink table, set down his own glass with a sharp, audible click. My own mother, seated nearby, started to rise, clearly intending to defend me, before I gently caught her eye and shook my head, asking her, silently, to let me handle this myself. I did the thing I do every day at the shop with something already past saving in the moment. I didn't try to win the argument in real time, in front of 40 stunned guests, at a gathering meant to honor my husband's memory. I said, calmly, Patricia, I understand you're grieving, and I understand this has been hard for you. I'm not going to argue about it here, today, in front of everyone who came to remember Miles. But I want you to know that everything about that decision is documented, thoroughly, in exactly the way Miles wanted it to be, specifically because he knew this conversation might happen someday. When you're ready to actually look at what he left behind, I'll show you every part of it. Comment the word protected right now if you've ever had to hold your composure through an accusation you knew, with total certainty, wasn't true. Because that's the exact moment this story turns. The formal mediation took place 2 months after the memorial gathering, in a conference room downtown, Patricia and her attorney on one side of the table, myself and David Kessler on the other, a neutral mediator, a court-appointed evaluator reviewing the insurance company's own independent investigation file, and, significantly, Dominic, who had asked to attend as an observer, seated slightly apart from his mother. I want to describe the room itself, briefly, because I remember it with a strange, heightened clarity. The specific hum of the fluorescent lighting, a pitcher of water nobody touched, Patricia's attorney, a sharp, composed woman named Fernanda Ruiz, arranging a thick folder of her own materials with the confident efficiency of someone who believed, at that point, that she still had a genuinely strong case. I remember thinking, watching her, that I understood exactly why Patricia had hired her. She had the specific, unflinching competence of someone who could make even a shaky claim sound formidable, at least until the actual evidence was laid out in full. David laid out the full record methodically, the way I imagine he'd done in dozens of similar proceedings over his career, though I don't think he'd ever had a file quite this thoroughly, deliberately constructed. The independent psychiatric capacity evaluation, conducted specifically and only for this purpose, concluding unambiguously that Miles had been of entirely sound mind, free of any cognitive impairment, at the time of the beneficiary change. He read aloud, at one point, a specific line from the psychiatrist's written report. The patient demonstrated clear, consistent reasoning throughout the evaluation, articulated his decision-making process without prompting, and showed no evidence whatsoever of confusion, impaired judgment, or external coercion. Fernanda Ruiz, I noticed, made a small, precise note on her legal pad, her expression tightening almost imperceptibly. Then came the video, which David played in full for the room. Miles's own voice, steady and clear, addressing his mother directly, by name, anticipating exactly this proceeding. I watched the mediator's own expression shift as the recording played. A small, professional stillness that told me, more than anything David had said up to that point, that this piece of evidence in particular was doing exactly the work Miles had intended it to do. The separate $300,000 policy came next, an unconditional gift structured specifically to demonstrate that Miles's intention had never been to cut his mother out entirely, but to separate her care from any decision-making authority that could later become a source of conflict between the two women he loved most. David noted, specifically, that the funds for this policy had come directly from joint savings Renee herself had equally contributed to, meaning that, functionally, half of the money securing Patricia's own separate gift had come from the very woman she was accusing of manipulation. I watched Patricia's face throughout the video, and I want to describe it honestly, because I think it's the truest moment of this entire story. She didn't look angry, watching her son's recorded voice fill that conference room. She looked, for the first time since Miles's diagnosis, genuinely, completely undefended. The specific, raw grief of a mother hearing her dead son speak directly to a fear she'd never fully admitted, even to herself, that she might have spent so much of his life trying to control that he'd needed to protect his own wife from her, formally, legally, with a lawyer and a psychiatrist and a camera, rather than simply trusting that his mother would eventually come to trust his choices on her own. When the video ended, the room was silent for a long moment. Patricia's attorney, visibly recalibrating, asked for a brief recess. Patricia herself didn't move for several seconds, staring at the now dark screen where her son's face had just been. During that recess, I stepped into the hallway for air and found Dominic already there, leaning against the wall, his eyes red. "I didn't know he'd done all that," he said, quietly, before I'd even reached him. The video, the doctor, all of it. I knew he'd changed the policy, but I didn't understand he'd built this hole. He gestured, helplessly, back toward the conference room. This whole case, basically defending you before anyone had even accused you of anything. I told him I hadn't fully understood the scope of it myself until David laid it all out that morning. Dominic shook his head slowly. "I think Mom's about to realize something in there that's going to be a lot harder for her than losing the case," he said. "I think she's about to realize Miles didn't trust her to just be sad without also trying to fight for something. And I think that's true, and I think it's going to break her heart worse than any ruling would." I overheard, faintly, through the partially open door of a nearby conference room where Patricia and Fernanda Ruiz had retreated, a fragment of their own private conversation. Fernanda's voice, measured but clearly recalibrating, saying something about the strength of this documentation and very limited grounds to continue, and Patricia's voice, smaller than I'd ever heard it, saying only, "I don't think I want to continue anyway. I think I need to talk to her." That was when Patricia asked, quietly, unexpectedly, whether she and I could speak alone for a few minutes without our attorneys present. David was hesitant, but I told him I wanted to do it, and we stepped into a small side room together, just the two of us, for the first genuinely private conversation we'd had in the 14 months since Miles died. "I need to tell you something," Patricia said, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it in 11 years of knowing her. "I don't actually think you manipulated him. I don't think I ever really believed that, if I'm being honest with myself. I think I just couldn't stand the idea that my own son needed to protect himself from me, formally, with a lawyer and a video, rather than just trusting I'd eventually come around on my own. It felt easier to believe you'd done something wrong than to believe that I was the reason he felt he needed all of this in the first place." I sat with that admission for a long moment before I responded. "I don't think you're a villain, Patricia," I said, honestly. "I think you loved him fiercely, your whole life, in the only way you knew how to love anyone, by trying to control the outcome, because control felt like the only thing you could actually offer him after everything you went through raising him alone. But that same love, I think, is exactly what made him feel like he needed to protect me from you, this formally, this thoroughly. I don't think that's a comfortable thing for either of us to sit with. I think it's just true," she cried, for a long time, in that small side room, and I sat with her while she did, because whatever else was true, I understood, completely, that her grief was real, and that losing her only son had broken something in her that a lawsuit was never actually going to fix, regardless of its outcome. Once she'd steadied herself somewhat, Patricia asked me something I hadn't expected. "Do you think he was afraid of me?" she said, quietly, not looking at me directly. At the end, "Do you think that's really what this was? Fear?" I thought carefully before answering, because I wanted to be honest with her without being cruel. "I don't think he was afraid of you the way you might mean," I said. "I don't think he thought you'd hurt me." Exactly. I think he was afraid of what grief might do to you. And to us, if there wasn't something clear and undeniable to hold on to once he wasn't here to explain himself anymore. I think he loved you enough to want to spare you the version of this where you spent years wondering, privately, whether you'd been wronged, even if that wondering wasn't really fair to either of us. Patricia nodded slowly, absorbing that. "He was always like that," she said, a small, unexpected smile breaking through the tears. "Even as a little boy. He'd rather do the hard, careful thing than let anyone he loved sit with an unanswered question." She looked up at me, finally, directly, in a way I don't think she ever quite had in 11 years of knowing me. "I think I owe you an apology that's bigger than just withdrawing a legal claim, Renee. I think I owe you 11 years of apologies, actually, for never quite letting you all the way in, and then blaming you for something that was really about my own fear of losing my place in his life." I told her, honestly, that I appreciated hearing that, and that I thought we had time now, real time, to actually build something better than what we'd had before, if she wanted to. She said she did. It wasn't a complete resolution in that moment. Grief doesn't work that cleanly, and neither, I've learned, does a decade of complicated family history. But it was a real beginning, the first one we'd ever actually had. Patricia formally withdrew her claim 2 weeks after that mediation, without requiring a final ruling from the court. The original beneficiary designation stood exactly as Miles had structured it. The full policy to me, the separate $300,000 gift to Patricia, entirely unconditional, exactly as he'd intended. I want to tell you honestly that our relationship since has not become simple or easy, because I think pretending otherwise would betray the actual complexity of everything that happened. But it has become real, in a way it perhaps never was during Miles's lifetime, when so much of our interaction was filtered through his role as a kind of buffer between us. Patricia and I have lunch together now, roughly once a month. Conversations that are sometimes still a little careful, still occasionally brushing up against old patterns neither of us has fully unlearned, but genuine in a way I don't think either of us expected, given everything that happened in that conference room. I want to describe 2 of those lunches specifically, because I think they show something the mediation room reconciliation alone couldn't fully capture. The first happened about 3 months after the case was withdrawn, at a small cafe Patricia had chosen, and roughly halfway through the meal, unprompted, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small, worn photograph. Miles at maybe 7 years old, gap-toothed, grinning, standing beside her on some long-forgotten beach vacation. "I want you to have this," she said, sliding it across the table. "I have dozens of them. I think you should have some of the ones from before you knew him, too, so you can see the whole person, not just the parts of him you gotta keep." I didn't have words for that gesture in the moment. I still don't, entirely, except to say that it felt like the first genuinely unguarded thing she'd ever offered me in 11 years of knowing her. The second lunch happened almost a year later, on what would have been Miles's 47th birthday, and Patricia arrived carrying a small bunch of ranunculus, imperfectly chosen, slightly wilted from sitting in her car, clearly not sourced from anyone with real floral expertise. "I asked at 3 different grocery stores before I found these," she said, a little sheepishly, handing them to me. "Miles used to tell me about the flower you sold him, the first time you two met. I wanted to bring you the same ones, even though I'm sure mine look terrible next to what you actually do for a living. I held those slightly wilted flowers longer than I've held almost any arrangement I've ever received professionally, because I understood, completely, exactly what she was actually trying to say with them." Dominic and I have grown closer too, in the aftermath of all of this. He told me, months later, privately, that watching that video of his brother had changed something in his own understanding of their mother, and of the specific, complicated cost of the kind of love she'd offered both of her sons throughout their lives, a love that was real and fierce, and also, in its own way, frightening enough. That Miles had felt he needed a lawyer and a camera to protect the person he loved most from it. Dominic has since become, in his own quiet way, something of a bridge between his mother and me, checking in with both of us regularly, gently, the way I think Miles himself might have eventually done, had he lived long enough to watch this particular wound slowly begin to heal on its own. I still run my flower shop. I still, every year, on the anniversary of that farmer's market conversation, buy myself a bunch of ranunculus, the way Miles used to buy them for me, because some habits of love outlast the person who taught them to you, and because I think he would have wanted me to keep doing exactly that, carefully, deliberately, the way he did everything that actually mattered. I want to tell you about one more thing before I close this out, because it happened about 8 months after the mediation, and I think it circles back to where this whole story actually began. In the specific, practical work I do every day with things that are dying, and the careful decisions about what can still be saved. A woman came into my shop, visibly exhausted, ordering flowers for her own mother-in-law's funeral, and mentioned, almost apologetically, as I worked on the arrangement, that she and her mother-in-law had never quite gotten along, and that she felt strange, now, grieving someone she'd spent years quietly at odds with. I found myself, without fully planning to, telling her a version of my own story. Not in detail, not with names, but enough for her to understand that grief and complicated family history often arrive tangled together in ways that don't resolve as cleanly as anyone wishes they would. I don't think you have to have loved her simply, I told her, snipping a stem, watching the woman's shoulders slowly ease as she listened. You're allowed to grieve someone complicated exactly as complicatedly as they actually were. That's not dishonesty. That's just honesty about how real relationships actually work. She left with her arrangement and a slightly steadier expression than she'd arrived with, and I stood in my shop afterward, surrounded by flowers in various states of freshness and decline, thinking about Miles and about Patricia, and about the strange, winding path that had led the three of us, together, to something that finally, eventually, felt like an actual family, rather than two women each, holding their own careful version of a man they'd both loved. Here's what I want you to take from this. If you've ever been accused of something you didn't do by someone who was really grieving, something much larger and much harder to name, sometimes the people who hurt us most aren't cruel. They're simply drowning in a fear they've never learned to name directly, reaching for whatever story lets them feel like they're still protecting something, even when what they're actually doing is causing harm to the very people that loved person spent their whole life trying to bring closer together. Comment the word protected one more time if you made it all the way to the end. I want to know exactly who stayed with me for this whole story. Subscribe to Pieces of Us. My mother-in-law sued me for my husband's life insurance. She just never knew until she watched his own face say it, exactly how carefully he'd already protected the both of us.